Good morning. We are in the beginning of a new class. You have studied poetry of the 16th century, 17th century, and to some extent of the 18th century. But now you're going to read the best kind of poetry, the most loved ones. That is the Romantic poetry this year. This poetry will enable you to love nature, to look at nature with a different perspective, and to enjoy all that is good around you. It brings out lively feelings, though it is subjective, it is lonely, it doesn't make you feel like being very social, and it tells you to move away from all that social life, from criticism and from hatred above all. So, we are going to read the pre-romantic and romantic poets this year. I'd first like to introduce pre-romantic poetry. Why pre-romantic? You see, romantic came in as a movement, as an answer to classical poetry, as an answer to the constraints of classical poetry. Naturally, when someone tries something new, he will try to be close to what the trend is as well as put in something new. This is evident in every field, in every art, and in every form of art, and of course, poetry. Pre-Romantic Age, or the transition period, as it is also called, it was the age of classicism. People got bored with the same kind of poetry, so naturally, some of the writers took upon themselves to try something new. So, this period followed the age of classicism and came to be known as the pre-romantic age. Why transitional? Transition means change. So it was a period of change. And if you go back to history, it dates from 1770 to 1798 and it lasted for about 30 years of the late 18th century. It exuded new sensibility. Why new sensibility? You see, I've used the word new again and again. So that is what happened to poetry. It took a new garb, it took a new shape, it became new. That is why you say that there was some new sensibility in this kind of poetry. In fact, this period, in the second half of the 18th century, we can observe a new sensibility in poetry and a new generation of poets coming up. Coming to the characteristics, In brief, these poets used subjective, autobiographical materials which marked a new trend towards the expression of a lyrical and personal experience of life. They were less intellectual and more emotional, presenting a variety of emotional states of the soul. You will come across a few words. Why subjective? Most of the poetry was written in first person, and the poets began to share one's own experiences. Then they used autobiographical materials. The poet shared his own experience, his own childhood, or his own feelings on seeing something or when something happened to him or her. This marked a new trend, and the poetry that they wrote became more lyrical, and of course, they shared their personal experiences. They were less intellectual. This was the poetry of the heart. Poetry became emotional, and they presented a variety of emotional states of the soul. Coming to the characteristics of pre-romantic poetry, they are a return to nature, the cult of sensibility and melancholy, a cult of the primitive life, a love of the strange, exotic, and sublime, an interest in the Middle Age, an interest in Gothic architecture, and the claim of taste and imagination. So, here's a list of 7 characteristics of the pre-romantic period. Coming back to the first one. A return to nature expressed through an interest in the picturesque, the wild, the lonely, and the desolate. The poets returned to describing nature. In classical poetry, there was a lot of description of people, men, and manners. But these poets found a way out. They returned to nature and they started expressing the beauty of nature, the beauty of wildlife, beauty of being lonely, and of course, sometimes desolate. The cult of sensibility and melancholy that they expressed, it was through the love of ruins, idealization of solitude, meditations on man's unhappy destiny. That became their kind of poetry. You would find many poems written in a solitary mood. There are meditations, and the poet is in love with the ruins. Next point, the cult of primitive life. They always held primitive life as one with nature. So they did not like civilization. There was this longing for last earth earthy paradise in which lived in communication with nature. They also showed a distinct love of the strange, the exotic, and the sublime. There was this interest in the Middle Age, which is considered as mysterious and barbarous. You'll find this in some of the poems and more when you read Romantic poetry. They also showed specific interest in Gothic architecture as a typical expression of the medieval spirit. You see, whatever happened in Middle times was also presented by these poets because there was this suspense factor in this kind of poetry. The claim of taste and imagination against reason. They always brought back this love for imagination. They strongly believed that imagination must not be subordinated to the intellect. So there is a lot of poetry coming very spontaneously and with a lot of imagination. A simple thing can be the source of imagination. It can be a portrait, it can be a graveyard, it can be some time of the day, it can be a season. This is the kind of poetry that came up. Here are the poets who are categorized as the pre-romantic poets. James Thomson, Thomas Gray, William Collins, William Cooper, and William Blake. You see, James Thomson is considered as the pioneer of transition period or the pre-romantic poetry. What he did as a revolt to the classical trend, he thought of writing something and nature came to his mind first. So he decided to write about seasons. Two extracts from seasons are prescribed, one from winter and one from autumn. Thomas Gray was another poet of this period. His An Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard is very popular till date. It describes the philosophy of life in a very serious manner. It also has an epitaph, which is also believed as something he wrote for himself. William Collins also brought out beautiful poetry. His Ode to Evening is another characteristic poetry of this pre-romantic age. William Cooper had a bit of religious inclination, so he has written some poems in support of Christianity, as well as a very sad poem on the receipt of his mother's picture, which you'll be reading. William Blake, the last of these, the one who is prescribed, wrote two kinds of poetry. In his two volumes, The Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience, you have a collection of beautiful poems. And he is also considered as one of the early romantics. He was a pre-romantic poet as well as almost a romantic poet. Thank you. You'll have a very nice reading throughout. When I begin with the first poem, the extract from Seasons, Winter. And then we will move on to the extract from Autumn, titled Autumn. And of course, I've mentioned the poets. We'll read the other poets soon. And hope you have a very nice session. Hope you read more and hope you enjoy this kind of poetry to the end. Thank you.